Very good. Well, welcome to FearTalk 18. This is the second one in the series that I've done with Barb Stengel. And this has been really on fear, philosophy of education, justice, all kinds of issues around moral issues that we've been talking about. I encourage you to watch the first one of the series, and we're just going to dive right in here this morning, Barb. And I was thinking of a couple things from the last talk that we did. And I remember one where I think you said something, I'm paraphrasing, so check me out. It's, well, when it comes down to it, fear, end of learning, hard stop.
That's definitely something I would have said, Michael. So whether I said it exactly that way or not, I don't know. But I agree with that. I think fear has to be associated, however you think about the origins of fear and how fear gets generated, that it is always associated with withdrawal. It's always associated with avoidance. We hear about fight and flight, and there is occasionally, but even fight is resistance. Even fight is pushback. And so I think that that's relevant to education. No more learning, no more growth if you have fear, because you're simply not open. You're not moving toward anything. That's not to say it's always going to be easy, that moving toward, but I think that's true. I think fear is about withdrawal. I think it's about moving away from the very possibility of growth.
In one of your articles, you said something I thought was quite an interesting statement. It was to the effect, let's see if I can see it. It's, somewhere around 2013, you wrote, I thought, a really fantastic paper. It's called So Open It Hurts.
Oh. ...
I just been reading it recently, and I went, I find that such a rich, good hitting paper. We'll talk about what happened when you actually maybe delivered that paper, and then what happened in the years up to when you moved on into Vanderbilt University, because this was just before you would have come into Vanderbilt University, I believe.
No, actually, it's right after. So
right after?
Yeah.
I write that paper. So, but there's a couple of statements I will read, and the one I think is relevant to what we were just talking about, this fear and learning and, the shrinkage. You put it in a little different way, which, I don't think I've ever heard anyone say it in this particular phrasing. In the contemporary consumer culture, and here you're talking about the losing of our ground. In philosophy, in education, philosophizing, theorizing, and really at large as citizens, I think, in this postmodern turn. So correct me if I'm just playing with what you got. And you say in this contemporary consumers culture, this nexus of feeling, thought, and action is getting habituated as fear. That habituated as fear, that seems to have a lot behind it. You don't necessarily go into it in that article. I'd really like to tweeze that out a bit.
Okay, so let's do it. I mean, I think you would have a lot to contribute to that.
Yeah.
Now, part of my reference there, and this was started as a talk for the Philosophy of Education Society. It was a presidential address for the Philosophy of Education Society. But and those folks would, by and large, not all, but by and large, be familiar with Dewey's theory of habit, which is the understanding that that we live much of our lives, including our moral lives, out of habit. And that's not a bad thing.
Yeah.
Because if those habits are well formed, if we have been socialized into positive pro-social behaviors, etc., then these habits are good. And we don't really have to think about it, because we're not, we don't have to think about it because we've been habituated. But it's not a bad thing that we act out of habit, because we, as humans, couldn't possibly make decisions every moment of every day about everything that comes up.
Kind of
So,
an evolutionary efficiency, really,
yes, yes.
for learning.
And so and I'm particularly interested in Dewey's moral theory, but
Yeah.
so if I exercise my well-formed habits, which some might call virtues, on a regular basis, nonetheless, there will come circumstances more often than we like that challenge that, where two values or two virtues are coming to conflict, or I have a duty to my job and a duty to my loved one, or something like that. And then those kinds of things require reflection. So Dewey would tell you that habits, reflection and moral deliberation is what we do when habit fails, but it takes both habit or virtue and reflection, moral deliberation, to understand moral action in the world. Now, the point that I was making in that particular sentence, and I'm very interested to hear your take on it,
Yeah.
is that since 9/11,
Yeah.
since maybe going back as far as Nietzsche saying God is dead and
Yeah.
truth is
Yeah.
not fixed and firm, but certainly since 9/11, certainly in the 21st century, we we have been facing what Sigmund Bauman calls liquid fear.
Yes.
Um,
Yes. Yes. That was such a good
yes,
concept.
and this is what I mean by it's habituated. That that nexus, the term that I use, but that place where what we think and what we feel and what we do are fused into action and into these virtues or habits, those habits have by and large been shot through with fear and
Saturated.
characterized as fear. Yeah.
Saturated, I think, is a term that Bowman was using. That's the liquid quality of it. It
Yes.
seeps in between every crack, every
Yes.
signifier, and therefore wets, soaks, attached to all signifiers. There seems to be little discrimination. So fear is not just the habituation. What I understand is it's not just habituated for a really good, purposeful, efficient, well critically thought out, you know, application of the fear, assisting the learning process.
Yes.
It
Yeah.
starts to become something so soaked, so heavy, so dense, then causing an overwhelming of our nervous systems is one way to think about it,
Mhm.
because we're always on alert mode, emergency time,
Right.
emergency reactions. And that's what I thought when you were saying, we start to become habituated as fear.
Mhm.
See, it wasn't even saying habituated to fear.
Mhm. No. Right.
I thought that was an interesting, just subtle distinction. Habituated as fear.
Yeah. And that's
Because
quite
I could
interesting.
have said conditioned. Why didn't you just say, oh, we're becoming more fear conditioned? Well, arguably, psychologically, we are becoming more fear conditioned through right emergency signals attached to a particular object, a particular event, and then you put high amounts of continual terror, distress, anxiety kinds of, emotionalities to it. But I think habituated as fear really also was removing that possibility, which you talk about in your work and Dewey did, is that, whoa, fear is also most of the time excitement. We're
Mhm.
probably not labeling it the right way. But when you see you're soaked and you're saturated in fear, any kind of way of making a connection to fear, as in that more positive, excited sense, and activating sense, was getting it gets sucked back into this default of, oh no, it's actually a threat. It's not just it's not excitement anymore. It's almost
Yeah.
like we lose the distinction between excitement and this saturated withdrawing fear completely. Like our
Now,
distinction.
one thing I bring to this conversation that I think is important is that, for me at least, fear is not something that's sort of out there in the universe waiting to be soaked up or saturated, to use your phrase. And I'm interested in on this point in the work of Sarah Ahmed, who is now an independent scholar, but wrote a really wonderful book in 2003, I think, called The Cultural Politics of Emotion. And she was really interested in this question of how emotion travels, in particular, how fear travels. And you're sort of hinting at this or messing around with this kind of idea. For Ahmed, the emotion, the affect, attaches to objects. So for some people, for instance, snakes, this is an example I use a lot. For some people, snakes are objects to which fear is already attached. And so as those objects, if snakes all of a sudden came out of the woodwork or out of the ground or whatever it is, because those objects for many people carry that affect, then it travels. But this is a really interesting question for me, and one I'd, again, love to hear you talk about. Why is it that, going back to at least 9/11, but certainly lots and lots of examples in the past 2 decades, why is it that fear is traveling? How is it that objects are getting around and allowing, because it's not just like mass hysteria. It's not that you catch it from me and I catch it from you and I give it to my grandchildren or something. It's that it is attached in meaning to objects. Now, those objects have much more currency. I'm thinking about guns, for instance. I'm thinking about a lack of gun control laws. I'm thinking about the pandemic. I'm thinking about COVID and what people, what people associate with COVID. And then we have to take a look at media. We have to take a look at how it is that we know so much about each other, about various places in the world, about what's going on, and about these objects that have the capacity to transfer and transmit fear.
Yeah.
Because it's the objects that are traveling in the world. It's not like I have a disease and I'm passing it on to you.
Yeah, that's so important. So I think, the quick summary I would have is we're talking about fear is in no one place. And as you just said, it is not an object in that way. Yeah, we can turn it into an object. We can try to measure it. Yeah. And I would always say, so just for practical, that's partly. So this is where we come to, our epistemology of fear, which is a topic I've taken up big
tried to
time.
wrestle with that a
Yeah,
good bit.
because that is, and we brought it up in the last talk a little bit too. It's like, what is the purpose of the knowledge and the method that discusses the topic of fear? That we should be looking at what's that purpose, as well as what so-called fear ends up being, in meaning. So that really is that idea of a discourse, right? Construction. Okay. And that's why I would say both of us today are talking about a constructed notion of what I like to prefer to use the language fear patterning.
Oh, okay.
Fear patterning.
Why did you settle on that? Fear patterning. What is
I think it's the artist in me, number one.
Okay.
And I've actually,
that's fair. I mean,
I've actually
the trick with all of this, Michael, is how can people hear you? What are the idioms that you use? What are the metaphors that you use that allow people to hear what you were saying?
Yeah, and so he disappears off the screen and appears with his little pedagogical tool.
Okay, good.
Different ways to construct reality or solve a problem. You can construct it by making the, this kind of shape,
framing it,
the solid outline, color it in. This, you can go to this one, get diversity inside, but you still have that boundary. What's the other possibility aesthetically is to break that black barrier, but you can still create that rectangular shape. And here you can still create the rectangular shape, but it's in a really holistic way. The background, like in a gestalt, mixing with the foreground. Porous, boundaries, open, closed, lack of diversity, maximum diversity. Just a simple tool I've used, and then I ask people questions about their values. Which ones of those did you like? Which one do you think's beautiful? I actually did surveys of this with teachers, one school, 200 and some kids. And it's just fascinating to watch our bias toward those mechanical models compared to the organic models C and D, which were perceived by most people as scary. And from an ecological or an artistic point of view, that D model, that open, that's reality. That's as close as we get to how things are created. Their environment blends with the thing, and it's the co-related. But you can see, the security need as you move up to that A and B, high security. At least that's what it feels like. But it's also a prison. You have a great statement in one of your papers, and it's one of your titles. I think you called it, let me just read the subtitle. I think it was the same paper that I just gave you the title of the sub. Yeah, there it is, the subtitle. So it says, so open it hurts. And then you go, enabling, therefore we can, and these are in quotes, in the dangerous, secure world of education.
Yes.
Dangerous, secure. That's that A and B model. They're dangerously secure. They will kill you. There's no room to breathe.
And as you know, philosophers have been arguing about what Quine and Dewey and others have called the quest for certainty throughout the 20th century, partly because philosophy since it's at least roots in Athens anyway, maybe not before that, maybe not the pre-Athenian philosophers, but it's been rooted in a quest for, okay, what is the answer? And if we don't get the answer, there's no answer. And of course, that's not so. And one of the reasons why I'm attracted to pragmatism, because I think pragmatism is a worldview that sort of acknowledges that certainty is not one of the possibilities, not in science, not in philosophy, not in ethics, certainly not in religion. But that doesn't mean there's no answers. That doesn't mean there's no comfort. That doesn't mean there's no support in those fields. And in fact, there's quite a lot, as we know. I mean, science has given us all kinds of opportunities to understand the world without certainty, but with a great deal of predictability, with a great deal of likelihood that, things will come. And I would argue the same thing is true in morality, that no, we don't have certainty, but we do have, it's just not true that anything goes. The fact that you don't have one answer doesn't mean every answer is just as good.
That's really what this one was. I actually asked some clinical psychologists at a treatment center for youth, which is the most healthy model. So I was kind of getting the metaphors from the actual drawing to the metaphor of that drawing as a method, because they're all really methods of knowing.
Yes.
And when I asked them about which is the most healthy, they all picked B.
B.
The entire team of clinical people.
Oh, so you have some kind of boundaries, but some diversity within the boundaries.
Yeah, that's comfortable. Okay. That's our computer screen.
For most people.
That's our computer screen. That's our TV set. That's the picture on the wall.
Right.
Somebody else created the frame, and we're like playing inside the frame. You don't actually get to manipulate the frame. Here, so they said, and I said, well, I picked D as the most healthy, and they were quite, angry about that. And one of them said, no, that's schizophrenia.
Yeah, can't
that's
be.
That's someone with a borderline personality. They don't have boundaries. Yeah. And I said, sir, do you see a rectangular shape in that? Yes. Undeniable. Just as you said. It's secured. It's secured by purpose and intention.
Yes, and function.
To create that object. Oh, this was an arbitrary object I picked. And yet how you get there is quite uncertain and diverse and multiple.
Yes. Let me bring up something you sent me earlier today.
Okay.
A reference to a book by Darshan Narvaez and
4 Arrows.
Yes, thank you. That I was not familiar with, although I do know Darsha's work because of my involvement in the Association for Moral Education. And I was quite surprised. As I told you, I was sort of like, oh, I would not have guessed this was the direction that she was going in. Nonetheless, I don't know if you have paid attention to what you sent me, but there was one um, listing basically of common dominant worldview manifestations in the West, what we would take to be, out of Western philosophy, et cetera, and Western science, and common indigenous worldview manifestations. And what's really interesting there is you might think of them as binary. The very first one was rigid hierarchy versus non-hierarchical. But there was a point, as you know, in this listing that said, this is not a binary. It is a spectrum. And the question of whether you need some hierarchy or you need no hierarchy is a question of the circumstance in which you find yourself. It's not a question of, yes, there's only this or only that. And, you have to say, looking at the indigenous manifestations, that they feel a little saner for the most part than most of the ones that are dominant. At the same time, it is true that in today's modern world, constructed world, the indigenous worldview doesn't always work. It can't be just in a world that was bound by nature, that worldview, these elements, courage and fearless trust in the universe, socially purposeful life. Yes, these work pretty easily. But in a world that, with capitalism, with certain kinds of built environments and other things, that we have to be aware of, the dominant worldview manifestations have been created and evolved to meet the needs of this world we've created. And this is, again, one of the reasons why pragmatism appeals to me, is that the pragmatists are the ones who will say, of course the dominant view is right, of course the indigenous view is right. So if that's true, we're asking the wrong question. It's not either the dominant view or the indigenous view, but what's the right question? What's the question that we should be asking that allows us to live well? And you and I talked about this last time, living well in the world we exist in.
Yeah, no, that's a good clarification, and always helpful to come back to, is just as I'm starting to understand pragmatism too. I see it has, at least the way you articulated it, it seems to have definitely a postmodern sensibility to it, and that's like the D model. In some way, it's got that. It's not seeking that secure position, which modernity in its sort of, stereotypic, albeit, but still pretty firm, I think, seeking that security system of, we can get the answer, we'll use this method and we'll get it, So that's the way I see pragmatism is slipping in that direction of already a critique of modernity's foundational ontologies, really, right? And
well, and if you think about it, think about the history of philosophy. So, we have Plato through Kant. There is this quest for certainty. There is this, okay, we're going to find the answer. And there's a debate going on around the time of Kant and Hume between, okay, the way to get to truth is through the empirical, or the way to get to truth is through the, I'll call it intuitional, but the deontological in Kant's terminology. And that's where Nietzsche says, you people are on a fool's errand here. It's not that what you're saying is wrong or bad, but you can't make claims of the kind that you think you can. Now, everybody gets all bent out of shape about Nietzsche as the first sort of deconstructionist, and I can see why. But I think he was, as later postmodernists were, for the most part, looking not just to destroy, but to figure out, okay, what can we say? This is like where I come to this, yes, we can, or what can we do?
Okay.
Because there are always things we can think and things we can do, things that are, as Dewey would say, warranted assertability. We have reasons, good reasons for saying this or doing this. And as long as we have those reasons, We move forward with our action, with our speech, with our claims, and then we test them. And we figure out, is that what we can do? And I think in this age of fear, the problem is that we are stopping ourselves, that we are not moving forward. We are not moving into the world. I think that's true of the politics in the US right now. Rather than go ahead and engage on the very big differences between those who really do want some sort of democracy and those who really don't want democracy and want what they call economic freedom, but not necessarily democracy, we're not really having that conversation. Instead, we're just demonizing each other. And as soon as you see people demonizing each other, you know you're talking about fear.
Yeah, thank you. No, that's great. And I think that's the indigenous worldview. I've looked at those precepts that they have for both those worldviews, and one of the fundamental ones is complementarity of
Yes.
opposites. And if you don't hold that, we talked in the last talk about dialectic, the dialectic movement for ways of knowing and the methods of knowing. Now, well, let's go back to your classes that you taught, facing fear. You started this, I think, in 2007, 2008. I think you
Yep.
actually had some undergrads, I believe.
That's right.
Yeah, and I thought, okay, that's, not a lot of people are doing that, just to let you know, in the educational world. They're
Yeah.
not doing courses on fear. I can tell you, I've
No,
researched this for
I'm
decades.
aware of that. And
So
one of the reasons I was able to do it, though, this is important.
it is important. Why?
It, because
Wow.
it would be, I might have taught such a course in a philosophy department. But again, it would have to be an elective, and it's not the usual kind of elective. And it's a mistake to look at fear philosophically only. You have to look at it both philosophically and psychologically, but also existentially, because psychologists have theories for certain functions and purposes. They build the frame for certain purposes of understanding. Philosophers build a frame with different purposes of understanding. But when you and I are trying to live in the world, in a world where fear has been the fear reaction has been habituated in too many circumstances. I mean, think of what we're doing to kids in school as we harden schools to prevent school shootings. I don't know if we're preventing any school shootings, but I am quite sure that we are scaring children, that we are causing children to feel systematically insecure in a place where most kids, not all, but most kids have felt systematically secure, where they got lunch, where somebody knew them and called them by name and cared about them. And as soon as we put in various security systems, as soon as we train children I'm all for training teachers, by the way, in the drills around shooter drills, active shooter drills, etc. I'm not sure I think we should be training children, because I think as soon as you do that, it's a little like you and I in the air raid drills. I don't know if you were
Yeah,
part of this, but
definitely.
when I was 6, 7, 8, 9, we had air raid drills at least 4 times a year, or maybe once a month. I don't remember, but we had to sit under our desks. The alarm would go off and we would get under our desks. And I was smart enough to know that that wasn't going to do any damn good. That if something exploded, the flying glass was going to get us. And if it was nuclear waste, nuclear power, that we were going to fry. Maybe not immediately, but in the long run. I mean, I knew enough about science at that time. And I think all it did was really kind of scare kids.
So get back to, you were able to do this teach this course. You
Oh,
figured out how to frame it.
okay.
And,
I'm
and
sorry. I
it
got off
sounds
track.
pragmatic. I mean, you were very practical, right? You wanted these students,
Yes.
teachers, to actually learn a usable skill, not just,
Well, they were mostly teachers, but this was the reason I was able to do it, actually, is this was a freshman seminar.
okay.
So the university had as an instructor, you could give the course any content you wanted, as long as you focused on some kinds of orientation, some reading, writing, thinking skills, speaking, listening,
Yeah.
as long as you, attended to the kids and their transition to college. And I'll be honest with you, I thought fear was the perfect course to do this. Most of my students were, in fact, education majors because their advisors told them to take this course with me. But not all were. There were some who were not. And we did some fabulous things in this course. I mean, one of the things we did was a high ropes course. So we'd go out and get our heart rates up, and myself included, climbing, the 40-foot telephone pole and jumping off of it. That was, 5 out of the 20 kids had no problem just climbing up and leaping off. And the rest of us, myself included, had a really hard time getting up there. And some couldn't do it. Some couldn't get all the way up. Some couldn't get off. I'm very happy to say I got up and off the telephone pole. And at the age of, probably 55 or something, I thought that was an accomplishment. But so we had an element of sort of existential experience of fear, in addition to reading philosophy, psychology, religious studies, some other pretty interesting studies that aren't always included in the
Nice.
in the college curriculum.
So that interdisciplinary approach. And then the other thing that strikes me about that lab, if you will, of that learning lab you constructed, was it was a socially constructed experience. It's like,
Completely.
let's not just, pump up my willpower. And I know you critique old notions or so-called old paradigm of the courage, the notion of courage in one of your papers.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought that was very interesting. You're moving toward even, I think, a more feminist idea of
Yes.
courageousness. And I'm
And
all for
communal
that.
and indigenous. I mean, it matches up with many of the things in the indigenous column.
I
You're right.
agree. So, this communality, and then when you go to a med, she's really a social cultural theorist, thinking always about fear, not in that just individual psychology that we talked about again. That becomes the dominant kind of discourse, individual psychology of fear.
Yes.
And you're really looking at a group practicing. Why did the other ones actually finally get off the pole? Is because of the social group, not making fun of them, but supporting and
Right.
giving information and saying, we care about you.
Right.
So
And here's how you do it. Here's how to put your, they're down below yelling, put your foot here, do that, whatever.
Yeah.
You're right.
So this is that positive social communal context, right? Social construction, knowledge, situated, practiced in group form. So this is the idea, really a justification for why we still want classrooms for kids and young people.
Yeah. No, I mean, I don't question that some things can be done digitally. I don't. And there are some kinds of content, there's some kinds of, but not even with every field. For instance, I wouldn't want all of even a computer programming degree to be online.
No.
There have to be elements and experiences that go with that. And I've always argued that about online programs, that there has to be glue that holds these individual digital courses together. And that's almost always of a communal kind, as you're suggesting.
Well, that's certainly, I think, where we come from, and it's certainly my understanding of John Dewey and what I think is a general social philosophy that I associate with pragmatism in general, certainly John Dewey. And so John Dewey at one point said, when he came back from China in 1922, and he got an interview by Charles Wood, and Charles Wood was asking, as for teaching the whole truth as far as we understand it to the children of our schools, well, why don't we do it? John Dewey answers, fear is in the soil in which wars are bred. Fear engenders hate. Human relations become inhuman. We are quite sure to discover that they have been poisoned by fear. Cowardice in public office, but the most insidious poison I know of in modern society is cowardice on the part of those who are charged with the responsibility of teaching our youth. And the boys and girls in New York schools are not getting half a chance. They are the victims of an inherent timidity, if not an active intimidation within our school system. There can be no real education unless there is fearlessness.
Mhm.
But New York teachers are not free to teach. 1922.
And of course, that's true today.
Thank you. No
That's true
kidding.
today.
That's my experience. You were right in the heart of that world,
Mhm.
of school systems. So this is the word fearlessness. I don't know if John Dewey ever used that word another time, but being me, the obsessive researcher, I snooped for it and found
Okay.
it.
I'll check my sources again as well. I don't know. I do know that passage, and I suspect he said some things like that, but whether he actually used the word fearlessness, I don't know.
Yeah,
And
it's
I'm gonna
fascinating. It's
I'm gonna
absolutely fascinating to me because we got somebody like, let's take 1998. So this is before 2001. Because I'm looking in the field of education, I'm going, how are folks talking about fear and fearlessness in
yeah.
education? Right. And I'm going back. I'm not a super historian, but I do like to go back. And so I see something show up in 1998. Parker Palmer, as you
Uh,
know, comes up. This is like, become the guru of teacher formation and
mhm.
teacher encouragement. The Courage to Teach, his famous book, printed umpteen times,
Yep.
has a whole institute of training that teachers go to workshops for in the States and around the world. And he comes up with two things that I thought were really interesting in there. He says is ignorance is not the enemy of education. He says fear is the enemy of education because fear empowers ignorance. Very interesting. Okay, catch that. Then chapter 2 in that book, The Courage to Teach, it's on the culture of fear. That's the title of chapter 2, the
Mhm.
culture of fear. He's the first educator I know to nail that down,
Right.
and he was using it from, I'm not sure what context, but sociologists have been on it since about 10 years before that. And but now he's brought it into education. So now we've got a context of a culture of fear. This is the matrix. This is the liquid fear, right? It's contextual.
Mhm.
And so the way I try to bring education, fear education to anybody, whether it's teachers or whatever, we're not just understanding and learning about fear in a neutral context, right? The
Right.
whole context is now a culture of fear. So that's why I think that concept is so important.
Mhm.
And again, if people want to look up my work on education and the culture of fear, I've done a whole annotated bibliography and historically up to sort of recent times.
And the interesting thing is, where did Parker Palmer go? I mean, I know where he went, and I know I have, my theories about it. But when you think about it, Parker Palmer was the greatest thing since sliced bread to most teachers in the time after he wrote The Courage to Teach. Everybody had that book, everybody talked about it. It was like, oh my gosh, this is what we need. But what was lost is what John Dewey talked about in 1922. Teachers are not free to teach. So the the courage to teach becomes moot. You don't need courage because we've gone instead, since No Child Left Behind, certainly, but it was coming before that, to scripted curricula, to these are the things you have to teach. If it's Tuesday and the second Tuesday in March, you have to be teaching X, Y, or Z, and that's just how it goes. And by the way, you have no time to divert. You can't take 2 weeks to help kids sort through even a school shooting and why that's happening and how it's happening. You can't do any of that in teaching because you don't have the time. You can't even take kids out of the building to pick up leaves in the fall. So it really, I think the courage to teach, I think if I gave that to most teachers now, I mean, some understand it, but if I gave it to most teachers now, it would just make them angry.
Yeah,
Like, what is this for?
yeah.
I Teaching doesn't require courage. I was in at a party the other day, and the young man who had been a former student of mine,
You
who
got 20 seconds.
okay, anyway, this kid had been a student of mine. He said to me, "Why didn't you tell me how bad teaching was?" And I think I did tell him. I don't think he wanted to hear it, but the point is that he got in and found out there's no need for courage because there's no freedom.
Yeah, that's a really powerful conclusion to our dialogue. We could
Yeah.
have many of these, as you know, And who knows, we might in the future. I so appreciate you joining us and look forward to the comments online.
It's a pleasure.